Um, Welcome. This is the second segment of this lecture on civil liberties. And I spoke in the last segment about one kind of criticism of the notion of civil liberties as a focus of activism and organizing, which was that perhaps this traditional notion of fighting against arbitrary state action was too narrow. And now I want to talk about the flip side of that, which is one kind of advantage of having quite a narrow understanding of civil liberties. And I think I think there are many powerful reasons to stick to this what I call the minimal conception of civil liberties. And I think the most powerful of these is that it's very important to secure widespread political consensus on the importance, I should say, social and political consensus on the importance of protecting civil liberties, quite independently of other political ideologies one might have in terms of how one wants the polity to be organized, whether one wants a communist state or a Hindu Rashtra, or independently of one's partisan party political preferences, whether one's a supporter of the Congress or the BJP or the left parties. Um, so there's an understanding of civil liberties as rights that all have reason to want, regardless of their views on other issues of about the economic or cultural structure of society. Um, and another reason for emphasizing this kind of neutrality of civil liberties with respect to ideology is that all political parties, regardless of their ideology, have an interest in the exercise of coercive government power. And there's a traditional understanding made famous in the line that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The thought is that people who have power have an incentive to misuse it, and it's important to have checks on that kind of misuse, regardless of who is in charge. And again, that kind of, in some cases, counter-majoritarian pressure can come from the courts. In other cases, it can come from organizations of civil society. Um, there are many ways of actualizing this kind of notion of neutrality. And what I want to do is talk about two famous examples, one from the American context, and one I would say an example that deserves to be more famous than it is in the Indian context. And I'll think about them. Um, I'll refer to in the ACLU context this kind of slogan, um, which is a commitment to defending speech that one hates. And some of you will recall this slogan attributed to Voltaire. Um, I hate what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And um, the underlying idea is that it's only when you have this kind of commitment to defending speech that you hate that you demonstrate um, a commitment to free speech as a matter of principle, independently of uh, one's own ideological leanings and interests. Um, and the most uh, famous case um, in the US context has been the defense of members of the American Nazi Party to march in the town of Skokie, Illinois, the town with a large proportion of Holocaust survivors. And famously, the ACLU defended their their right to march. Now, this is something that has a large been memorialized in various ways. This is from the website of the ACLU, the reminiscences of um, the lawyer for the American Nazi, well, the Chicago um, area Nazis led by a man called Frank Collins. You can see him there, Frank Collins. Um, it's the subject of a recent uh, documentary on a man called Ira Glasser, who was the executive director of the ACLU soon after uh, this case came up. Um, I'm going to just play for you a clip of uh, a piece by the journalist and lawyer Glenn Greenwald on the Skokie case, and it's an excerpt from a much larger interview with Ira Glasser. And I'll just play you the clip that has to do with describing the Skokie case. Why do I do that? Because you'll see Glenn Greenwald is somebody I admire a great deal. A very strong advocate for this kind of ACLU conception. And in the US, at least, there's a big debate now in the context of the election of Donald Trump and the the growth of some kind of radical right wing politics in the U.S. There's a big push, maybe even to question that kind of ACLU consensus. But let me just play you a clip from this long interview with Ira Glasser, which you can find on YouTube, to give you a sense of Greenwald's excitement.
The case involved a group of actual Nazis, people who dressed up with swastika armbands and the historic uniforms of the Nazi party in World War II era Germany. And they applied for a permit to have a march through Skokie, Illinois. And Skokie, Illinois was a town filled overwhelmingly not just with Jewish residents, but with actual Holocaust survivors, thousands and thousands of people who were in the camps in Eastern and Western Europe during the war, who survived the Holocaust, and they had tattoos on their arm, and that was the defining trauma of their life. So you can imagine how horrifying and traumatic it would be to have to watch through their town marching people with those uniforms of the people who slaughtered many of their, or most of their family, who tortured them, who put them through such hell. And yet the ACLU, led primarily by Jewish lawyers and Jewish activists, defended the right of the Nazis to march through Skokie. They sued the town of Skokie, Illinois, when Skokie's city officials denied the Nazis a permit to do so. And at the time, it was an incredibly controversial stance, not just in the...
So, well, for more, you can go to YouTube and look up this this episode, and I'd certainly recommend Glenn Greenwald, who's now become in some ways quite a controversial figure, for as a very strong advocate for this kind of traditional this traditional conception. Now, as Greenwald ends by saying, the Skokie case was controversial at the time. It continues to be controversial, and really, this is part of an ongoing debate about the permissibility of what's called hate speech in a democracy. One should note that many European countries have much less radical positions on some speech. For instance, the propagation of Holocaust denial is prohibited by law in, I think, many European countries, including Germany. You see, in the wake of COVID, there's been a debate about the dangers of spreading misinformation of COVID, and hence a renewed interest in the need for censorship. So I don't mean to suggest by any means that the ACLU position on Skokie was the correct one. I think it does point to the need, first of all, for more conceptual and theoretical clarity about the nature and limits of the right to free speech. And it's also, I think, an interesting exercise to ask how these standards should vary depending upon the contextual features, political or social, of the country in question. Um, why is it, for instance, that the US is such an outlier in this matter? Um, but regardless of what one thinks of the specifics of the Skokie case, and whether the ACLU was correct to fight it in the way that it did, I think there are important lessons to learn from it. And one lesson, I think, is really the fundamental principle that one can defend X's civil liberties without defending X's beliefs or aims, right? So, in the Skokie case, to defend the right of Nazis to engage in peaceful protests is not to endorse their views. In fact, as Greenwald points out, that um, the lawyers such as David Goldberger were Jews, had no, or many of the lawyers involved certainly were not sympathetic by any stretch of the imagination to the Nazi cause. Um, but the point goes well beyond freedom of speech, and I should remind ourselves that freedom of speech is only one of the civil liberties. Um, uh, there are many others. Um, to take another example, think about debates about rape law in India. If one defended somebody who was accused of rape and said that they deserve a fair trial, that doesn't mean that one's um, endorsing rape by any stretch of the imagination. One wants to endorse the principle that everyone deserves a fair trial. And again, you can ask, and maybe not that um, straightforward a question to ask. Well, why should that be an important right in a state? And again, what does it amount to in particular cases? So these again are theoretical questions that come up. But that fundamental idea that you can defend civil liberties without defending, you can defend the civil liberties of somebody without defending what they want to do by exercising those civil liberties. It's often obscured by governments, again, of all ideological stripes. So, for instance, after 9/11 and the setting up of Guantanamo Bay, uh, George Bush and other defenders of the war on terror that the U.S. Undertook, used to say, look, if you're defending the rights of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, then what you're doing is, you want Al Qaeda to succeed, and you can think of plenty of examples closer to home. If you take the Kanhaiya Kumar sedition case in JNU from a few years back, the claim was made, I think, by but the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, for instance, that if you're defending the right to free speech of somebody like Kanhaiya Kumar, then you are in favor of the breakup of the nation. And again, it's very important to rebut that kind of point by referring again to this principle, and again to reiterate that I would say the current moment is a grim moment for civil liberties, but in many respects, it's one of the, I think, depressing continuities of post-independence Indian life, that civil liberties have, in different forms and by different kinds of governments, been under attack. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about the Indian experience, and here I can't claim a great deal of expertise, particularly in the contexts of contemporary civil liberties organizations and even the emergency and post-emergency contexts. Um, I can say that at least it has been noted by some commentators that one weakness of civil liberties associations is that they have been too closely associated with uh, party political formations, sometimes at the left. Um, there have been some attempts at cross ideological civil liberties organizing, but as far as I can tell, they haven't been um, robust. Certainly, I think the emergency was um, possibly one of these moments. Mm. But I want to give a little bit of a flavor of what this might look like or might have looked like with a moment in the late 1940s and the 50s. I already spoke about the All India Civil Liberties Council in the last segment of this lecture, and I'm going to um, talk a little bit about the first Supreme Court case on free speech in 1950, just after the Constitution came into force, and it involved two journals. The a journal called Crossroads, which was edited by a man called Ramesh Thapar, who had been a member of the Communist Party and certainly a pro-communist um, newspaper. It's quite contemptuous of both the Congress and um, the socialists. And at the same time, that legal challenge was joined by a challenge by the RSS journal, which continues to this day, the organizer, uh, then edited by K.R. Malkani. And what I want to do now is just show you some slides from both of these journals um, and talk about um, this element of political consensus. So I'm just going to now change to the slides, change to a slideshow. And these are slides I got digitized from the Nehru Memorial Library from their microfilms. They're not in great shape. Well, this is Crossroads, the front cartoon. And I won't zoom into this, but you can see, for instance, here is Rajaji being surrounded by American capitalists and vultures. There's Nehru, who's reading a book on China's destiny. Somebody who looks like Patel, who's burning some pledges. This, I think, is the volume from 1949. Let me switch. Um, Here's um, another example of the kind of content that Crossroads carried. This is the what used to be called the Hyderabad police action, and also a very famous case, in fact, having to do with a series of death penalty cases in Telangana, which is the subject of ongoing work by Rohit Day. There's a man called D.N. Pritt, who was in the list of people who formed the National Council of Civil Liberties, and he ended up being a lawyer for some of these Telangana activists. This is again an interesting history that is waiting to be told, and thankfully is being told as we speak. I'm going to turn now to the organizer. This is a cartoon from February of 1950. It's an and it's one of the cartoons that led to censorship of the organizer. And you can see Nehru is uh, then as now the subject of criticism. There's Nehru preventing refugees from helping themselves to evacuate property, and here he is, um, what's the word? Well, mollycoddling or appeasing minorities. That's clearly a Muslim man. You have uh, Patel flogging a dead horse. Um, it's interesting, by the way, to think of the level of dissent that was, in fact, around available at this point in time. Um, Now, I won't go into the reasons why uh, Crossroads and the organizer got into trouble, which led to censorship orders being passed. In the case of the organizer, it had to do with um, fears that its reporting would lead to communal violence in Delhi. It was reporting on the refugee movements in Bengal from what was then East Pakistan, but reporting in, I would say, quite a what's the word, in a fiery manner, perhaps calculated to lead to uh, retaliatory violence when they're reporting about anti-Hindu violence in East Pakistan, and the fear was that this would lead to anti-Muslim violence uh, in Delhi. That was what led to the censorship. Um, to cut a long story short, both Crossroads and the organizer went to Supreme Court to challenge their censorship on the basis of Article 19(1)(a) of the new constitution, and they won. And one of the interesting things to note here is this editorial, the last paragraph of this editorial of June 5th, 1950. Um, Democracy lives by a free press. It's the first casualty of fascist regimes the world over. If free press goes, democracy too goes. And what's interesting to me is this claim that we and our Bombay contemporary should have been the vehicle of this democratic dispensation is a source of gratification to us. So it's interesting to think of the RSS, even though it doesn't name the Bombay Contemporary, the Crossroads was a journal published out of Bombay, is making common cause with it. And I'm just going to move to an interesting cartoon in the same edition. Um, 2 points to note. I'll come back to my text. One is, of course, in the current moment when I would say at least one, though by no means the only, but perhaps the greatest threat to freedom of speech comes, in fact, from the ruling party. It's striking to see that there is a tradition of its ideological affiliates protecting free speech quite strongly, both in the 1950s as well as during the emergency. And that's a history that it would be nice to recall as a form of building political consensus on the importance of these rights. It was also the case that figures of the then Hindu right, such as Shama Prasad Mukherjee and N.C. Chatterjee, did try and fight for civil liberties on a kind of non-partisan platform. In fact, that All India Civil Liberties Council that I mentioned was, yeah, I think both of them were presidents of that council at different times. N.C. Chatterjee, whose son Somnath Chatterjee, incidentally, was a communist and former speaker of the Lok Sabha, died a couple of years back. N.C. Chatterjee fought for the civil liberties of communists. So I think there was some kind of cross ideological attempt to defend civil liberties. And civil liberties activists of the time had this kind of understanding. I'm just going to go to one more slide. Um, you'll see this is from the document I showed in that last segment of civil liberties um, documentation in 1949 in this conference in Madras. And what I find striking about it is um, the fact that these activists see the arrest of communists and the RSS as sort of part of the same problem. Right? You have different uh, districts of what was then Madras province, and it talks about um, the number of communists arrested and the number of members of the RSS arrested. It's a fascinating document. It's available in Google Books. I encourage you um, to look it up. Um, but that's to my mind, a very clear moment. I'm sure it's not the only moment where civil liberties activists thought of persecution by the government as um, as the same problem, regardless of who is being persecuted. Um, I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that um, the government in these cases was wrong. I think that certainly when organizations, bodies are engaged or about to engage in violence, there's a case to be made for persecuting them. It's one thing that governments are for. But I think it's important to have a sensibility that one must protect civil liberties, keeping in mind, the absence of violence and so forth, independently of the ideological color, either of the government in power or of the people who are being persecuted. And I think that one of the great challenges for civil liberties today is that we really haven't developed a political culture in which these rights are really taken for granted as the background against which political contestation must take place. Um, I think, sure, there are many reasons why this is so. But you can imagine, if you had the ACLU style um, sensibility, you'd imagine that a civil libertarian, let's say belonging to the RSS, might defend the rights of an Umar Khalid or a Kanhaiya Kumar, not just rights to freedom of speech, but let's say rights in Umar Khalid's case to a fair trial, a speedy trial. So we don't have that. I think it's not simply a matter of the fact that we don't have that. Not simply a matter of organization, persuasion, activism. There has been that, but I think it's also a matter of having some clarity about what the content of civil liberties are, and in each case we should why we should protect them. Frankly, it does look like there's not that much cultural or social backing for many civil liberties either. I think in the case of due process rights under the criminal law, of how relaxed Indian society seems to be about things like encounter deaths. Encounter deaths don't involve due process of law at all, and of course, there might be good reasons why people are suspicious or impatient with the language of due process that leads them to celebrate uh, encounter killings. But for a civil liberties activist, that's a very scary place to go. Okay, let me stop here, and in the next segment of the lecture, I'll take up a part of the constitutional story of civil liberties protection and some controversies and challenges that arise both then and in the present moment. Thank you.